All right, we're back on MorningLine. Thanks for joining us this morning. Our guest is John Harris with the Tennessee Firearms Association, talking about issues of guns and mass shootings and the like. And, you know, it's interesting. John was good enough to bring in some statistics here. These compiled again by the federal government?
Well, the first one there that you're looking at is actually compiled by the FBI.
Oh, the FBI, okay.
And it covers data that relates to the volume of firearms clearance transactions, what we call NICS checks, over the last 21 years.
Yeah.
And what it really shows is the volume of firearms being purchased legally at gun stores across the country.
Meaning not individuals, but one person could be buying 5 guns, and that would, you know, there'd be 5 guns listed here. So what's interesting is to see just how many people are buying and owning guns. And you look at this from 1999, John, 9,138,000. I guess transactions,
which could include multiple guns per transaction.
Oh, good. Okay, so it could be even more than that.
Oh, yeah.
But 9 million transactions, and I'm sure some of them were. Many people buy more than one gun at a time. As of 2018, almost 20 years later, 26 million. So from 9 million to 26,181,000 transactions last year. So a lot. I mean, and what percentage, do you guys have any breakdown, does the NRA, of what percentage of Americans own weapons? Now, of course, Americans, you know, there's children and such who can't, you know, at an early age, but any idea, is it would you say 30% of Americans is high or low?
Oh, I think that's extremely low. And the reason is a lot of the data is self-reported, and so I think it's underreported.
Okay, well, I was pulling that just out of thin air, so I don't know. No one's reported 30%. I was just wondering, would you think 50%, and again, the definition of weapons would not be some Daisy BB gun that some kid gets for Christmas. It would be more a legitimate weapon that you have to go through this process to buy. Would you say 50% of Americans own a weapon?
I would say
adult Americans?
Well, you know, there's not really an age limit on owning a weapon in the country.
I guess not. I mean, when you're old enough to go buy one.
A lot of kids in Tennessee get them for, you know, Christmas when they're 10.
Sure, they do it for hunting. No, you're right. I have a friend of mine whose son got one at 10, a shotgun to go hunting with. So, yeah.
He's good with fishing.
No, not fishing, hunting.
But Pew Research, which I think is a pretty reputable research entity, has a gun policy segment on their research, if you go to their website. And your listeners can look it up. It's pretty simple. And they've got data as of, I think, 2018 on the spectrum of gun ownership or access to guns in the country. And it's really an interesting look, because you've got the people that self-report as being owners, which is pretty high. It's around 50%.
Okay.
But then you've got the percentage that report as having a gun in the household. So you may have a spouse that doesn't think they're the owner, but their husband or their wife owns the gun. Okay, and that self-reporting is a lot higher. And then you get to the group that report that even though they don't own a gun, they grew up in a household that had them, or they have gone frequently shooting with friends, or they go to the range and they rent them. Because you got some states like New York where it's pretty difficult because of government restrictions to even get the gun and be an owner. But I think the data is, and the fact that we have a hard time, you know, accurately tracking it, because their guns have been here for 3 centuries, you know, and so it's a self-reported and I believe strongly underreported data point.
Okay.
But I would say if you look at households, it's way over 50%.
Wow. Okay. All right. Let's go to Debbie. Debbie, good morning. Hi, Debbie.
Good morning. How are you?
Morning. What's on your mind?
Well, I have a question. I heard you talking about the castle law, and I just wonder if that works with in your car, with everybody kind of, you know, high anxiety on the roads and stuff, or if a female were to have car trouble or something. Does the castle law cover you in that way? And if the gentleman could address a little bit more about perceived threat. You know, what's the difference, I guess? I know in my mind, but a perceived threat and a real threat. And I'll hang up and listen, and I thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Good questions.
Yeah, going back to what we said just a little bit earlier, the Castle Doctrine concept is part of self-defense. And in Tennessee, it's codified in Tennessee Code Annotated 39-11-611. And it now includes a heightened presumption if you're in certain protected locations. So your home, your residence, your business, if you own an RV or you're using an RV, you know, when you're in it, a hotel room, a tent, and a car. Because they talked about passing a separate carjacking bill, but instead they just added motor vehicles to the same standard as a house. Okay? And basically what that standard says is if you're in that location, in your car, and it's a carjacking, someone's got to be trying to enter your car, you're presumed to be in imminent fear of death or serious bodily injury. And what that does is that shifts the burden in a criminal case on who has to prove what.
Now, if there was not a Castle Doctrine applying to the car in that case, let's just say that law wasn't on the books, and I'm in my car, and some hoodlum comes and grabs open my door and is going to try to get, and I do the same thing you just said, and I pull out the gun, and I say, hey, and he keeps coming, and I shoot him. Well, I mean, I don't need a law. The cops and the courts are going to look at that and say, well, this guy was getting in your car and you shot him. That's called self-defense.
Well,
I mean,
that is exactly true. And this is really important for people to understand. The Castle concept shifts a burden of proof in a trial from the defendant to the state. It creates a presumption that the shooting was justified.
Okay. So it's just, that's where it starts from then.
It's really a courtroom issue.
Okay.
For most people, it boils down to self-defense. Was there imminent fear of death or serious bodily injury? And she asked about, you know,
perceived threat.
Perceived threat. Well, when you look at the statute and the case law on that, they talk in terms of it having to be a realistic threat, and what they do is they use the same kind of terminology they use in car wrecks and tort cases. They resort to a reasonable person standard. So they say, would a reasonable person, when the jury's being asked to look at it, have considered these facts to constitute an imminent fear of death or serious bodily harm? So not only do the facts have to have existed, like the guy this morning reaching into the car trying to whatever he was doing, but would a reasonable person have considered that to be an imminent threat of death or serious injury? So not only does the victim, the person who resorted to deadly force, have to have had an imminent fear, but at the same time, a reasonable person would have. They layer these two standards together. And like I said, this largely has to do with what happens in the courtroom a year or two after the fact. What I tell people when I go talk is, if you got to the point on the street that you realistically anticipate if you don't run away or defend yourself, you're going to get killed or seriously hurt. Like the pucker factor setting in just before a car wreck, you know you're about to get whacked. You know, if that's sort of what's transpiring, if you can articulate the threat as being real enough that you're concerned for your life, then self-defense is probably. It's
interesting though. I wonder if that line is moving a bit, because I think perceived threat, and again, you can't always climb into someone's head and see. And the truth is, in this day and age especially, there are people out there that are more skittish than others.
Oh yeah.
And are on edge because of what they see happen, and they may have a weapon and have a hair trigger there. And I'm to the point now where if I was in a situation perhaps downtown and lost, and I wanted to knock on a window to ask someone, hey, is that road down this way? I'm not going to do it because I'm worried if it's a woman in the car and I knock on the window. I would never do this, you know, and I'd find another way. But I'd be afraid, though, even these days, to even approach someone at their car and knock and ask, because they might say, wait a second, boom. And, you know, if someone knocked on my window and it was behind the window, I'm not going to react. But I know some people are more skittish than others.
That's very true. And I show my age sometimes when I use this example when I'm speaking, but there's a scene in Crocodile Dundee.
Okay. I'm trying to remember. I love that movie, but I can't remember it all.
Remember that there's a scene where he and the news reporter are coming out of a party, and they're in New York, and they're walking through some plaza, and a young man approaches them and pulls out a switchblade and says, you know, give me your wallet, give me your money. And the reporter, the girl, says, you know, Mickey's got a knife.
Oh yeah.
And Mick laughs and goes, that's not a knife. And he pulls out this Bowie knife.
I remember that. That scene's about the only one I remember from that movie.
So she had a realistic imminent fear.
Yeah.
He didn't.
Right. So yeah, different perception on that. And yet though, what counts is the individual's fear? I mean, except in extreme cases. If someone is just so afraid of their own shadow and someone's just walking by and she really was genuinely afraid in her head and pulls a gun and shoots some poor guy because he's just walking by, you got to look at that. It's like you said, it has to be a reasonable person. The jury say, is that reasonable, or were you just such a chicken that you overreacted and killed some poor guy who was no threat to you at all?
That's why both standards are a part of the of the test.
Gotcha. Okay, makes sense. Let's see if Lewis, are you there? Are you there, Lewis?
Yeah,
Go ahead, sir.
yeah. I was wanting to ask about black powder guns.
Okay.
Yeah, they got an Army Navy black powder 6-shot revolver Colt and a 50 caliber black powder rifle. I'd like to know what the laws is on them, and I'll get off.
Okay.
Black powder. What does that mean? Just define those
Black
weapons
powder.
for people. Is that like a musket?
Well, it could be a musket, but there's also cartridge black powder. So, for example, almost all of your Civil War era weapons were black powder, regardless of how they fired, because it's the technology at the time.
Gotcha.
And so, black powder and muzzle loaders are, for purposes of federal law, they're defined in the Gun Control Act, which is at 18 U.S.C. 921, as antiques, because they were technology that existed on or before 1899, or they're modern replicas. Okay. But basically, it's a muzzle-loaded weapon, or one that shoots cartridge black powder, as opposed to modern propellants. Okay, that you buy at Walmart. And for purposes of federal law, a black powder weapon, an antique, mainly we're talking muzzle loaders and the kinds of weapons the caller referenced, the old cap and ball percussions, are not considered firearms for purposes of having to go in and do a background check. So this data we talked about earlier, none of that includes black powder.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Now, Tennessee, unfortunately, has multiple definitions for what is a firearm. They apparently can't make their mind up or keep track of when they define it one way versus another, and so it was inconsistent. But up until May of this year, Tennessee did not have that exclusion for antiques. Now, what has happened is, as of May of this year, they've changed the definition in Tennessee and they've adopted the federal rule. So now, guns that are antiques for federal law, black powder muzzle loaders mainly, are also antiques for state law.
Well, why would they be treated any differently? I mean, gun's a gun. I mean, it's a nice antique, and I assume most people have them as collectibles and they're up on the wall somewhere. But I mean, a definition of a gun, in my mind, is something that shoots a bullet and has, gunpowder in it, and maybe there's a hammer that's my simplistic thing. And anything that has that, I would think, should just be called a gun. Right?
Well, they are, but it has to do with whether or not you got to go through the background check. Because if it's a black powder weapon, you can go on.
Is that less lethal?
Well, statistics show they're just not used.
Okay. I figured you'd say
they're
that.
Either sporting, collectors, or they're specific hunting seasons.
Okay.
Because they're considered primitive.
All right.
But you can go online and mail order those. They'll ship them to your house with no background check at all.
Okay.
But where you might put a cartridge in a modern rifle and shoot pretty fast, like we were talking earlier, you're spending 1 minute to 2 minutes loading and reloading a black powder for each shot, unless you're really good. And so you don't see people, I mean, you can, but you don't typically see people committing crimes, certainly not mass shootings these days, with that category of weapon. And so they're just really not an issue.
So would you say, that just made me think then, they've got a separate category for those guns, and I think that seems prudent. Then you have the others. What about the idea of, not, as you said, the laws are tricky, but not eliminating the right to be able to purchase an AR-15, but maybe on the other hand, taking it to a different level, that as opposed to if I just want to go buy a 38 handgun, I go through a certain process. Maybe if I want an AR-15, I have to do a bit more.
Well, they did that in 1934 under the National Firearms Act with respect to short barrel rifles, short barrel shotguns, and machine guns.
Okay.
And Tennesseans and people in the country can legally acquire short barrel rifles, short barrel shotguns, and I'm talking the little bitty short stuff.
Okay.
And even full auto machine guns. You acquire them basically just like you would buy a regular gun, but there's a $200 transfer tax. So you got to notify the ATF that you're buying it. You got to pay the $200 tax, and then you got to wait about a year for them to acknowledge that you paid it.
So it's basically just the cost and the weight. There's no other, say, investigation into the buyer or anything along those lines. Okay.
And what we see is those weapons.
Yeah.
I mean, those were considered gangster guns. And that law was
That's what I think about Tommy gun or something, right?
That was considered a way to stop heightened criminal activity, and what they found out was repealing prohibition did it. They didn't need to ban the guns.
There you go. That's it. All right. Well, I was wondering on that. Did you see? Of late, there were a couple scares at a couple of county fairs, and up in Kentucky, I think at the state fair, I think in Louisville or Lexington, I think it's Louisville, they cleared out the area, and it turned out a bunch of kids were arrested because they were blowing off firecrackers. And there may have been a brawl, but firecrackers, and a lot of people thought. And I asked John when he sat down, John, can you tell the difference between a gunshot and a firecracker?
Yeah, that's right.
And you gave me a smart aleck answer.
Yeah, I feel more recoil with a gun.
Okay. Well, true. All right. But beyond that, I mean, you can understand why, and that's where we're at this edge now. And I believe those kids were troublemakers, knowing that by knocking off those firecrackers in a crowded area at a popular fair, people were going to panic. And it's those kind of things to the point now where I've got folks telling me on Facebook they don't go out much anymore. They're not going to go to a sporting event. They're not going to go to a concert. They're not going to go to a fair, which I've said, I'm more aware than ever before, but I'm not living in fear, and I'm going out there, and I'm going to defend myself. But people are staying home. They're so afraid now.
That they are, and that's extremely unfortunate. And part of that goes back to that Crocodile Dundee example. Is in that case, and it was a made-up story.
Yeah.
She didn't know how to deal with her personal security. She wasn't comfortable that she could defend herself. He was.
Right.
He recognized a threat that he could handle versus one that he couldn't. And unfortunately, I think we've got a lot of people, and I think it's increasingly true as we change society's fabric, who maybe didn't play sports, don't know how to defend themselves. They are raised in the TV game era, where they don't have a physical comfort or realization of what their self-defense capacity is.
Yeah. And
you're going to have some people that maybe are in wheelchairs or physically smaller or handicaps that just really don't even have that level.
Yeah.
And it makes a big difference. But I think a large part of that insecurity comes from, have they had the training, or have they pursued the training either with or without guns? Because they could go take a judo class and feel more confident that they could handle themselves in public.
Yeah.
And what people aren't getting any of that.
No, they're not. Times have changed a lot. You made a movie reference. Let me make one that's more current. Did you see the movie Sicario with Benicio del Toro? It was about the war on the drug trade, and it's amazing because at the end of it, without getting into too much, he had a conflict with one of the officers he dealt with who didn't like the way he handled things in the big city, and he just basically went to her at the end of the movie and he goes, "You're going to have to move back to the Midwest, some small town, and do law enforcement there where the rule of law still rules, because times have changed." And it has. It's shown, the drug wars and everything else, and weapons, and in some of the big cities, which Nashville, by the way, is becoming. And there are people that remember Nashville, and it was a smaller, more calm pace, the ones that have been here for a long time. And I think it's catching some of them off guard. I moved here from Los Angeles 20 years ago, and it was a breath of fresh air, because I moved from LA because of an incident involving some gangs and some gunshots in a vehicle that one of our photogs was in. I'm done with this. Nashville's becoming more like that now.
Oh, it is. And the question is why?
And why? And I think just growth. Growth has a lot to do with it, and type of people and what comes. But anyway, people aren't used to it, John. And it's, I was telling you that it's the exception to the rule in our morning newscasts when we have a day that goes in when I come in and there's not a shooting to report. Maybe not a fatality, but someone getting shot. Yeah. And I remember when I first started working here, a shooting overnight was a big story. Get the live truck out there, get the helicopter. We didn't have a helicopter back then, but get it up there, go, go, go. Now there's a shooting, it's maybe a reader unless it's something really big.
It's true, unfortunately.
And so, would you say, I know you study, guns around the world. We talked about this before in things we've done with stories, you and I, but it's different in other countries, okay? I'll say this, whenever there's a mass shooting, it makes news around the world, one way or the other. It does seem like we have more mass shootings here. Now, I'm not saying there's not more violence of different types in other countries, but the U.S. has cornered the market on mass shootings like this. Now, you're going to tell me, no, they've got mass shootings like this in England, because you would be wrong.
Well, no, they're
not like
knifings
this.
now.
Okay, they're knifings, all right? Now, give me a knifing over a shooting any day. But I mean, is it? We do have more mass shootings in this country.
Well, I think part of it's how you define it, but there's a volume of it that I think is unacceptable. Okay, no matter what country you're in.
Well, I would agree, of course.
Okay, and you've got some European countries that had much stronger gun control laws than we have now, where the government is for one reason or another, is actually telling their citizens, you need to go buy a gun and defend yourself. We can't handle it. There's too big a problem. And as we see the volume of aggression growing, whether it's mental health or terrorists or whatever it is, we're down 100 and something cops. And the cops don't have the duty to defend us. They show up and draw the chalk lines. There's no duty on an officer, even if he's standing there, to protect you legally.
Well, but they're supposed to protect and serve.
Well, that's what the car says.
Yeah.
And I believe what's on the car.
Yeah.
But there's no legal duty. So if the cop is standing there on or off duty and doesn't intervene, you can't sue them or the government because you got hurt.
I see.
Okay.
Right.
So self-defense, defense of yourself and your family, is really, in this country, always has been, a personal responsibility.
It's up to you.
And when we were a nation of explorers, people that settled remote areas, they understood that. They carried guns, they defended themselves from wild animals, bears, Indians, whatever it was. They handled it on their own. They didn't call the Mounties. And we've gotten to a point now where we're more like sheep in a lot of instances, where there's population segments that don't want guns, that don't think there's a need for guns. They don't even feel secure in their own homes. And their solution is take guns away from more citizens. And that's just not going to work. It's going to take an element of personal responsibility. They're going to have to, whether it's a firearm that they feel comfortable with, or martial arts, or they live in a jail cell where they can lock themselves away.
Yeah, which I hate to see that.
Yeah, it's growing. You look at the security offerings that are out there, and you're hardening your homes.
Oh yeah.
East Nashville, a lot. I grew up over there. You didn't mow your yard without locking your door. And now people, leave their stuff in the yard and complain on Facebook that it was stolen.
Yeah.
And it's like, you didn't live here long, have you?
Right. You learned the hard way on that. And still, people aren't locking their car doors. They're leaving their keys in there. And as we've told a story on, more people are packing heat when they drive to protect themselves against carjacking, but then they leave their guns in there unsecured. And that's what these crooks end up stealing.
Yeah.
True. So you got to be careful on all that. John, always a great conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming on and giving us some perspective. We'll see. We'll be talking again soon, my friend, all right? We'll take a break. I'll be back with a programming note for tomorrow, right after this. Stay with us.